In July of 1216, Prince Louis of France set up his siege artillery before the walls of Dover Castle. The French prince had come to England to support a group of rebel barons against King John of England, occupying much of the country and now aiming to capture Dover Castle, known as the Key to England. The castle controlled the shortest sea route to France and thus Louis's connection to his logistical base at home. The siege of Dover Castle was characterized by the use of new types of artillery, brutal assaults, and near-impenetrable defenses. The very future of England hung in the balance. What began as a dispute over barons' rights, enshrined in the famous Magna Carta, quickly escalated into a full-scale French invasion, and Dover Castle stood as one of the last strongholds of resistance. This is how modern historiography tells the story of the staggering siege of Dover Castle. This is Prince John, the villain of many Robin Hood tales. His representation as a greedy, cruel oppressor has real historical roots. For many of his contemporaries considered the real Prince John, King John Lackland, a tyrant. In 1204, John lost much of the Angevin Empire to Philip II of France, and spent the rest of his reign trying to win it back. To fund these costly campaigns, he imposed heavy extra taxes on top of the legitimate feudal levies, collecting them through methods that were, to put it mildly, questionable. These relentless demands pushed some of his barons, royal vassals with vast estates, toward financial ruin, fueling growing resentment. The breaking point came when John arbitrarily turned against one of his closest allies, William de Barros, forcing him into exile. By 1212, several barons were conspiring, quote, to drive the king and his family from the kingdom and choose someone else as king in his place, even plotting to assassinate him during a campaign in Wales. When the conspiracy was exposed and the attempt foiled, the anger only deepened. When the king returned from yet another failed campaign in France in 1214, and immediately sought to collect the dues cutage to fund the next war, tempers boiled over. The barons refused to pay, arguing that financing ongoing campaigns in France went beyond their feudal obligations. That November, around 40 disaffected nobles gathered in the abbey of Churchbury St. Edmunds and swore not to support the king until he confirmed the traditional liberties that his great-grandfather, Henry I, had granted at his coronation. Essentially, they sought to define their rights as vassals and set clear limits on the king's authority over them. In early 1215, the rebellious barons brought their demands to the king in London. John deeply resented the proposed limits on his authority and the fact that the rebels appeared before him in arms, an act that was essentially a declaration of war. Nevertheless, he promised to meet with them after Easter to resolve the dispute. In truth, neither side believed a settlement was likely, and both began preparing for civil war. When John declared his intention to join a crusade on the 4th of March and cancelled his meeting with the barons, open revolt erupted. The rebels renounced their oath of fealty and took up arms. Led by Robert Fitzwalter, one of John's fiercest enemies, they laid siege to the royal castle at Northampton. John immediately called his mercenary forces from Ireland and Flanders, but their march was slow. In mid-May, before he could gather enough troops, the city of London, home to the Treasury and Exchequer, threw its support behind the rebels. From that moment, their cause gained momentum overnight, and the king realized he had no chance but to negotiate. On the 27th of May, the two sides agreed to a truce. 2 weeks later, on the 10th of June, 1215, John met the barons at Runnymede on the Thames. Over 5 days of negotiations, they drafted a document based on the Articles of the Barons, sometimes called the 48 Articles, setting out their liberties, rights, and privileges. This Great Charter, or Magna Carta Libertatum, would come to be seen as the cornerstone of English constitutional law. On the 15th of June, 1215, King John affixed his seal to the Magna Carta, agreeing to most of the barons' demands. The settlement temporarily ended the dispute, and most of the nobles renewed their oaths of allegiance to the king. But the peace was fragile. Neither side trusted the other, and John had no real intention of enforcing the reforms or curbing his authority in the long term. He quickly appealed to Pope Innocent III, who on the 24th of August declared the Magna Carta void on the grounds that it had been imposed under duress. The Pope also excommunicated the rebels. With this legal and spiritual backing, John advanced on London at the head of his mercenary army, determined to crush the uprising once and for all. Civil war had begun. John advanced as far as the River Medway, where Rochester Castle, occupied by the rebels, blocked his path. After his troops were repelled at the old bridge crossing, the king laid siege to the castle. When Rochester Castle fell on the 30th of November 1215, John had gathered a strong army. However, instead of pressing toward London, he turned north. He marched through central England to Berwick-upon-Tweed, which he captured on the 15th of January 1216, then moved south again through Colchester in East Anglia. Despite his successful campaign, the resistance only grew stronger. During John's campaign, the barons, struggling militarily, reached out to his arch-enemy, Philip II of France. In exchange for support, they offered the English throne to Philip's son, Louis, whose wife, Blanche of Castile, was a descendant of King Henry II of England. Louis agreed to send a contingent of knights to London as a vanguard. Despite his father's advice against the move and threats of excommunication from the Pope, Louis began planning an invasion. What started as a war for the barons' liberties soon turned into a battle for the English crown. The French invasion began in the spring of 1216. One foggy day, the watchmen along the Kent coast spotted dozens of sails on the English Channel. Soon after, an army came ashore. When the king heard the news, he withdrew westward to Winchester. To block further French landings, he stationed part of the English fleet, expanded and modernized during his reign off the Thames estuary. But on the 18th of May, a violent storm severely damaged his ships, allowing Prince Louis to land additional troops at Pegwell Bay near Sandwich. Louis immediately marched toward London. Canterbury surrendered without a fight, and Rochester Castle fell after a brief siege, clearing the way for the French prince to enter the capital on the 2nd of June. The rebels welcomed him as a liberator and proclaimed him king at St. Paul's Cathedral, though he was not crowned yet. Louis then pursued King John, reaching Winchester on the 14th of July and capturing it after several days of bombardment with his siege engines. With this victory, the rebels and their French allies controlled the two most important cities in southern England. Now, Louis set his sights on the fortress that controlled the crucial link to his homeland, Dover Castle. The English historian Matthew of Paris once described Dover Castle as clavis Anglae, the key to England. Commanding the strait over Dover, the fortress was both a strategic stronghold and a vital communications hub. As long as it remained in English hands, it threatened Louis's lifeline to his logistical base in France. If he wanted to ensure his reinforcements would not be met with closed gates, he had to seize the key to England at any cost. In July of 1216, French troops marched up to Dover Castle. What they saw was awe-inspiring. Perched like a stone giant on a coastal hill above the town, the castle was unrivaled in England. At its heart stood a rectangular keep, about 30 by 30 meters, a formidable stronghold in its own right. Surrounding the inner courtyard was a massive stone curtain wall dotted with towers, while further out, a huge U-shaped circular wall stretched toward the coast. This outer defense was broken only by a gatehouse flanked by two towers on the northwest side. Next to the gate stood several flanking towers, and below, separated by a deep moat, lay the barbican, a fortified gateway enclosed by a wooden rampart and its own moat. To enter the castle from the barbican, attackers had to cross a steep, narrow wooden bridge. This gateway was nearly impregnable. The formidable fortress was commanded by the seasoned knight Hubert de Burgh, the justiciar of England and perhaps John's most loyal supporter. De Burgh had earned his reputation in 1205 by holding Chinon Castle for nearly a year against the vastly superior forces of the French king. At Dover, he had only 140 knights and men-at-arms under his command, but he had stocked the castle with ample supplies and ammunition. Taking Dover Castle would be a Herculean task, but Louis was confident he could accomplish it. Before we dive back into the video, I want to say a huge thank you for watching. If you're enjoying these deep dives and want to help us keep the lights on and the research going, there are a few ways you can support the channel today. Grab a copy of Ken Follett's Kingbridge series via our link, which is a brilliant historical fiction series. Or listen to his books on Audible, which you can try for free for 1 month using our link in the description below. Or check out our history hoodies or our support black tea in the merch store. Or simply join the club and support us directly via Patreon for a few dollars a month. Everything is linked in the description. Thanks for considering it. Louis's troops made camp near the town, while the prince himself took quarters in a small monastery that also served as his command center. He spent several days surveying the terrain, inspecting the defenses, and planning his assault. According to the History of the Dukes of Normandy and the Kings of England, which contains a detailed eyewitness account of the siege, Louis then divided his forces into 2 groups. One remained in the camp by the town, while the other moved to a hill near the castle's northern gate, where it began assembling the siege artillery. The French prince had high hopes for his catapults, but faced with the mighty fortress before him, he also prepared a plan B. Troops not engaged in operating the siege engines encircled the castle, cutting it off from the outside world and blocking any incoming supplies. At sea, Louis's fleet completed the stranglehold by patrolling the coast. If the walls could not be breached, he would starve the garrison into submission. With Dover Castle surrounded, the French focused on the gatehouse. Alongside the catapults, they constructed a siege tower to bring their archers level with the defenders on the gates and ramparts. Workers also built a covered gallery across the moat to the barbican, protection that would later allow miners to dig beneath the wooden wall. The siege of Rochester Castle the previous year had proven how effective this tactic could be, even against massive stone structures. There, King John had undermined the keep and then packed the tunnel with 40 picks before setting them ablaze to collapse the building. The defenders of Dover Castle did not wait passively for the same thing to happen to them. Hubert de Burgh led an active, almost aggressive defense. Time and again, his men-at-arms charged out of the gatehouse on horseback, cutting down a few besiegers before retreating at lightning speed. From the walls, the defenders as marksmen, especially the crossbowmen, kept the enemy at bay, picking off workers in front of the barbican and cutting down anyone who ventured too close without cover. First 3 weeks of the siege passed with little progress for Louis. His army soon began to dwindle. William, Count of Holland, who had supported the invasion, departed to join a crusade. Many knights felt their duty was fulfilled after so long abroad, and, unsurprisingly, the mercenaries began grumbling over their wages. Despite his weakening grip on the situation, Louis vowed, according to the chronicler Roger of Wendover, quote, he would not leave the place till the castle was taken, and all the garrison were hung. In mid-August, Louis finally achieved his first breakthrough. The miners' work paid off, bringing down a part of the barbican. His men-at-arms surged forward, and in a bloody clash they fought their way into the forecourt, driving back the defenders and seizing the outer works. The first line of defense had fallen, but the real challenge still lay ahead. The impressive gateway towered before them, making their task look almost impossible. Around the same time, King Alexander II of Scotland traveled south to pay homage to Louis. The French prince met the young monarch at Canterbury and seized the chance to strike a psychological blow against the defenders. To undermine their morale, he invited Alexander to Dover, where the homage was publicly repeated. Louis already claimed the crown of England and enjoyed the backing of many nobles, but this was the first time a reigning monarch of another realm had formally acknowledged his status. a gesture of enormous symbolic weight. A few days after the ceremony, the Scottish king departed and Louis turned his attention back to the siege. Reinforcements arrived from France under Peter of Dreux and Thomas, Count of Le Perche. They brought not only fresh men-at-arms, but also grim news. Honorius III, the new pope, had upheld his predecessor's excommunication of Louis. It was a serious blow, but Louis was now too deeply committed to turn back. His only path was to conquer England, capture John, and claim the crown. As King of England, he hoped he would wield the influence needed to negotiate with the Pope. By early September, Louis's goal seemed within reach. The miners had nearly finished their tunnel beneath one of the two gate towers and were preparing to bring it down. As the workers made their final arrangements, the men-at-arms readied themselves for battle. Everything was in place for the final assault. The ground shook as if from an earthquake, and moments later the tower collapsed with a deafening crash. The attackers had been waiting for this moment, a chance to prove themselves, unleash their frustration after a long siege. In a fury, they hurled themselves into the fight. The defenders were just as resolute. For them, it was a matter of life and death. Louis had sworn to hang them all, and they had every reason to take that threat seriously. With desperate strength, they held the line, forcing Louis's men-at-arms back step by step. As soon as the breach was clear, workers rushed in with heavy beams to throw up a barricade. Despite the continued onslaught, they managed to seal the gap. Realizing there was no way through, the French finally fell back. After the failed assault, Louis was desperate. His men had spent over 2 months working toward this moment, and it had all been in vain. The delay also weakened his position elsewhere in England. Numerous barons loyal to the king continued to resist, and the garrison of Kent was being harassed by a group of archers under the squire William of Cassingham, who employed tactics reminiscent of the legendary Robin Hood and his merry men. Engaging in a form of guerrilla warfare, they repeatedly inflicted painful losses on the French. Louis needed to end the stalemate at Dover Castle quickly, or the invasion risked grinding to a halt. With a new assault requiring weeks to prepare and starving out the garrison likely taking even longer, he had no choice but to sign a truce with Hubert de Burgh on the 14th of October and lift the siege, for the time being, at least. Shortly afterward, on the 18th of October 1216, King John Lackland died. 10 days later, his 9-year-old son, Henry III, was crowned in Gloucester Cathedral, with the experienced knight William Marshal appointed as his regent. The death of the old king changed everything. The tyrant the barons had opposed was gone. When Marshal confirmed a slightly revised version of the Magna Carta on the 12th of November, most of the barons' grievances were resolved, and an increasing number of them rallied to the young Henry, recognizing him as their rightful king. In Dover, Louis tried to persuade the garrison that it would be better to recognize him than to place themselves under the rule of a child. However, Hubert de Burgh had no intention of siding with the French prince. Declaring his allegiance to Henry, he forced Louis to withdraw to London. Over the course of winter, more and more barons switched sides, and Louis found himself increasingly on the defensive until early 1217, when he was forced to return to France to fetch reinforcements. His march through Kent and Sussex to the south coast nearly ended in disaster. The French army was starving because resistance fighters systematically destroyed all food along their path and suffered heavy losses in an ambush near Lewes. The remnants of the army barely managed to reach the French fleet at Winchelsea. In Louis's absence, the Dover garrison treated the truce lightly. The men burned the infrastructures he had left behind, disrupted his communications with allies in England and France, and repeatedly prevented French ships from landing. They also raided the surrounding area to replenish their stores and snatch vital resources from under Louis's nose. When he returned to England in April of 1217, he resolved to put an end to their defiance. Dover Castle had been a thorn in his side for too long. Louis reached Dover on the 12th of May, prepared to stay for weeks or even months. The French prince was determined to take the fortress at any cost. Knowing Hubert de Burgh would ignore any offer of surrender, he abandoned negotiations and immediately positioned his artillery. In the meantime, he had reinforced his siege arsenal with a powerful new weapon, a massive counterweight trebuchet sent by his father from France. According to historian John Goodall, this was possibly the first trebuchet of its kind used in England. Its chief advantage over mangonels or traction trebuchets was the ability to hurl much larger projectiles over greater distances. Still, it was clear that even this formidable engine alone would not be enough to take Dover Castle. With a second attack on Dover, Louis was taking a significant risk. He had to split his forces. A large proportion of his army remained with Thomas, Count of La Perche, in front of Lincoln. Although the town had fallen, the castle stubbornly resisted. The siege of Dover Castle consumed nearly all of the remaining troops Louis had in England. Consequently, he was heavily dependent on reinforcements from France to sustain both sieges and avoid being exposed in the field. At home, Blanche of Castile worked tirelessly to gather troops and funds to support her husband. For the moment, she was only able to send 40 ships. Unfortunately, a violent storm struck right as the small fleet reached England, forcing it back out to sea. 2 days later, the weather had calmed, but the delay had given young Henry's supporters time to prepare. When the French tried to land again, the knight Philippe d'Aubigny was waiting with 80 ships. Some French captains turned back immediately at the sight of the superior force. Others attempted to break through. In the end, only 19 ships made it to the shore, less than half of the reinforcements Louis had hoped for. Even worse, d'Aubigny out-patrolled the coast, creating a serious blockade. Until Blanche could send a fleet large enough to break it, Louis had no choice but to make do with the forces he had. Meanwhile, William Marshall rallied the troops loyal to Henry at Newark and marched to Lincoln to liberate the city. He reached his destination on the 20th of May and dealt a crushing defeat to La Perche. When news of this reached Dover 5 days later, Louis was devastated. With the loss of his men at Lincoln, roughly half his troops were gone, and with them the military advantage. Also, Dover still held out, and Marshall was preparing to advance on London. Louis's position seemed hopeless. He dismantled his siege engines and set off toward London to begin peace negotiations with Henry's supporters. Just as an agreement was within reach, however, unexpected news arrived from France. Blanche and her allies had managed to assemble a sizable fleet after all. Buoyed by this development, Louis decided to continue the fight. The flame of hope flickered only briefly. When the French reinforcements crossed the Strait of Dover on the 24th of August, Hubert de Burgh was already lying in wait with an English fleet at the port of Sandwich. He launched a surprise attack on the passing French ships, delivering a crushing defeat and extinguishing the last spark of hope. After the defeat at the Battle of Sandwich, Louis finally gave up. On the 11th of September 1217, he signed the Treaty of Lambeth, renounced all claims to the English throne, and returned to France. Dover had not only been a thorn in his side, but also a decisive stronghold for the English resistance. The invasion had failed, and England had taken a decisive step towards its constitutional future with the Magna Carta.